In 1793, the French Revolution was 2 years old. The king had been beheaded. The aristocracy had been dismantled. The people had won. Then, over the following 12 months, the people who had led the revolution executed 17,000 of their own citizens. Not royalists, not aristocrats. Each other. In the summer of 1788, France's harvest failed. By the spring of 1789, a Parisian worker was spending 80 to 90% of his daily wages on bread alone. Not food, bread. Meanwhile, King Louis XVI was spending more on the royal household in a single day than most French families earned in a year. France was divided into 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, roughly 0.5% of the population, exempt from most taxes. The second estate was the nobility, about 1.5%, also largely exempt. The third estate was everyone else. 98% of France paid for the other 2. Louis XVI summoned the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. He needed to raise taxes. What he got instead was a revolution. In June 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate were locked out of their meeting hall. They reconvened at a nearby tennis court and took an oath. They would not separate until they had given France a constitution. The king's response 2 weeks later was to call in the army. The people of Paris responded by storming the Bastille. Within 2 years, France had abolished feudalism, declared the rights of man, and transformed from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI signed every reform presented to him. He agreed to everything, and it still wasn't enough. Because the question the revolution had raised, who should hold power, could not be answered by a constitution alone. In January 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined in the Place de la Révolution. The crowd cheered. It was the logical conclusion of a revolution that had declared all men equal, including kings. But executing the king created a problem the revolutionaries had not anticipated. If the king was gone, who was the enemy now? Maximilien Robespierre had a simple answer. The enemy was anyone who threatened the revolution. In 1793, he became the dominant figure on the Committee of Public Safety, the body that now effectively governed France. He was not a violent man by temperament. He was a lawyer. He dressed carefully. Before the revolution, Robespierre had defended the poor in local courts. He had written essays against the death penalty. He had argued that the state had no right to take a life. These were not performances. They were convictions he had held for years. When he arrived in Paris as a delegate in 1789, nobody noticed him. He was small, quiet, methodical. Other men were louder. Other men were more charismatic. But Robespierre read everything, remembered everything, and waited. By 1793, the waiting was over. The revolution needed someone who believed in it completely, and Robespierre believed in it more than anyone alive. He believed with complete sincerity that the revolution could only survive if its enemies were destroyed. The reign of terror lasted 12 months. In that time, 17,000 people were officially executed. Another 250,000 were imprisoned. The targets shifted constantly. First royalists, then moderates. than anyone who questioned the pace of the executions. The revolution had become a machine that required enemies to justify its existence, and when it ran out of enemies, it invented them. By the summer of 1794, the men who sat alongside Robespierre on the Committee of Public Safety had begun to fear him. He had made vague speeches suggesting that traitors still existed within the government itself. Nobody knew who he meant, and not knowing who he meant was the most terrifying thing of all. On the 27th of July, 1794, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre rose to speak in the National Convention. He was shouted down before he could finish his sentence. He was arrested on the floor of the chamber he had dominated for 2 years. The following day, without a trial, he was guillotined in the same square where he had watched his enemies die. His last recorded words, according to witnesses, were incoherent. He had no defense. The machine he had built to protect the revolution did not recognize the distinction between a defender of the revolution and an enemy of it. It had never been designed to. The terror ended with Robespierre's execution. France tried 2 more governments in 5 years, the Thermidorian Convention and the Directory. Both were corrupt, unstable, and incapable of ending the wars the revolution had started. In 1799, a general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup. 10 years after the revolution had abolished the monarchy, France had a new emperor. The French Revolution did not fail because its ideas were wrong. It failed because the mechanism it built to defend those ideas could not distinguish between an enemy and a defender. A system designed to destroy opposition has no off switch. Once it starts, it requires enemies to justify its existence, and when it runs out of enemies outside, it turns to find them within. Robespierre believed he was protecting the revolution. The people he executed believed the same. The question historians still argue about, and that nobody has fully answered, is whether there was ever a version of this that could have ended differently, or whether a revolution that begins by executing its enemies is already committed to eventually executing itself.